Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
So in the summer of 57, after those 3 years, he traveled up into Macedonia, which is back in Europe again. Then he journeyed to Corinth, which is in Greece. And he stayed in Corinth for the winter. And it's around that time that he wrote the second letter, what we know of as the second letter to the Corinthians. We know that he wrote that second letter to the Corinthians like at the time that he was traveling to Corinth. And then when he was wintering in Corinth, he wrote his letter to the Romans, talking about how he's going to be visiting Rome on his way to Spain. Say what? St. Paul went to Spain? We'll come back to that a little later in this lesson. We don't know if Paul ever made it to Spain, but he wrote to the Romans saying, I'm thinking of passing through Rome on my way to Spain. So sometime after Pentecost in 57 AD, or CE if you prefer, Paul left Ephesus for Troas, which is there in the west, and then farther north on the Aegean shore, and not finding Titus there. So he went there to find Titus to see if he could straighten things out with Titus about what was going on in Corinth across the sea. He crossed to Europe and Macedonia because that's where he found Titus, and he found the news of the reconciliation that had been effected in Corinth. Paul then wrote the second letter to the Corinthians, perhaps in two stages. Paul then traveled to Achaia and Corinth, where he spent 3 winter months and wrote his letter to the Romans, telling them that he planned to visit them on his way to Spain after taking a collection in Jerusalem. So if you're looking at the maps, whoa, that's quite some journeying there. He's now in Corinth, telling them that he's going to go down to Jerusalem to take a collection. Boy, Deacon Roy, imagine having to take a collection that far on Sundays. So he's going to go from Corinth down to Jerusalem to take them a collection, so he doesn't get robbed on the way. And then he's going to pass through Rome on his way to Spain. He's a traveling man. How did he travel? We can only speculate. How do we think he traveled? Probably either on foot or by some sort of pack animal, be it a horse or a mule. Or, of course, when he crossed the sea, he crossed in a primitive boat. It would have been primitive travel. So the road to Damascus, the conversion story, we often see artwork that shows Paul being knocked off of his horse. Is that how any of the Bible stories tell us it happened? Bible stories don't even mention a horse, but artists for centuries have portrayed him as falling off his horse. In the Acts of the Apostles chapter 20, that tells us that Paul set out from Corinth to Jerusalem. He's going to go deliver the collection now. By way of Macedonia, which means that he's taking the land route instead of the sea route. And he spent Passover at Philippi, and Philippi, we saw on the map, is there in northern Greece. Then Paul sailed to Troas, where he made his way down to the coast to Ephesus again, and then to Miletus, and then to Tyre and Caesarea on the Palestinian coast. He did cut it short. He didn't, on his way back, go back all the way by land. He just went back by land into Philippi, Macedonia, and then came back, sailed across, and went down took the sea route. Years 58 to 60 AD, or CE, Paul is arrested in Jerusalem. Who else do we know who was arrested in Jerusalem? Interesting. So Luke is giving us these two parallel accounts of these two people who traveled to Jerusalem and who go through a lot of suffering at the hand of religious leaders in Jerusalem. So Paul is going to be arrested in Jerusalem, imprisoned in Caesarea for 2 years, and that, again, if he's in prison, we know that he wrote the book of Philippians from prison, so it's possible that he wrote the book of Philippians from Caesarea during those 2 years. So the last 6 years of Paul's life, we don't have any record from Paul about anything that he did during those last 6 years. We simply speculate. We are imagining that it was some 6 years based on what the Acts of the Apostles tell us, but we don't have anything that was written by Paul that survives to this day that came from that time. So Acts of the Apostles suggests that much of Paul's suffering occurred during those last 6 years, and then he was imprisoned 4 times during those last 6 years. So we know that Paul wrote Philippians and Philemon from prison. It could have been during one of those imprisonments during his last 6 years. The Acts of the Apostles chapter 24 speaks of Paul bringing the collection to Jerusalem. Okay. So Paul tells us that he was going to bring a collection to Jerusalem. He tells the Romans that. And Acts of the Apostles actually confirms that, yes, the collection made it to Jerusalem. What happened in Jerusalem, though? We remember who lived in Jerusalem and who was head of the church in Jerusalem? James, the brother of the Lord. So Paul got back and had a tense meeting with James, the brother of the Lord and the head of the Jerusalem Christians, in which James suggested to Paul that he should act like a pious, practicing Jew. Oh, that's probably worth our looking up. When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Interesting. When we arrived at Jerusalem, who wrote the Acts of the Apostles? Luke, which, if you remember, traditionally, who did we believe wrote the Gospel of Luke? This Luke, who was a traveling companion of Paul. Interesting. So Luke says, when we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James. And all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. So far, so good. He's bragging about all that's happened. Verse 20. When they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, "You see, my brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law." All of these Jews are coming to believe in Jesus, and they still want to follow the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or to live according to our customs. What shall we do? Yikes. We are Jews following the law of Moses. We hear that you're telling Jews they don't have to follow the law of Moses. What do we do? Verse 22. They will certainly hear that you have come, so do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. Encouraging them to be obedient to the Jewish law. Those 613 rules that Jesus said, love God and love neighbor, and the rest are details. James, the brother of the Lord, and those in Jerusalem are encouraging them to follow that Jewish law. Verse 25, as for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. So Paul's presence in the temple court in Jerusalem causes a riot. How interesting. Luke told us that Jesus' presence in the temple caused the ruckus as well. And a Roman tribune had to intervene to save Paul. Paul gave a long speech in self-defense in Hebrew or Aramaic, presumably in one of those languages. And then Paul was brought before the Sanhedrin, or the Sanhedrin if you prefer, and created a dispute between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The tribune sent him away to Caesarea to be judged by the Roman governor, who at that time was Felix. Who was the Roman governor before that? Pilate. Dr. Pilate was Felix, before whom Paul defended himself. And Felix kept Paul in prison for 2 years. If you were a governor, why would you keep someone in prison for 2 years? Thinking that eventually, if he wants out, he'll find people who are willing to pay for that expense, right? And so Felix was looking for a bribe and put off judgment and left Paul in prison for 2 years. Along comes the next governor of the Roman province. His name is Festus. And Festus opened up Paul's case again, thank goodness. Paul argued that he had committed no crime against the Jews or against Caesar, and so the procurator, Festus, invited King Herod Agrippa II to hear the case. Neither of them found Paul to be guilty, but what did Paul do? He appealed to Caesar, and if you want to be in front of Caesar, where do you have to be? Gotta go to Rome.
He's going there anyway.
He's going there, yeah. I mean, it's almost like his destiny is Rome. It's almost like a free trip to Rome, you know? I'm appealing to Caesar, take me to Rome, free trip to Rome, and then once I'm set free by Caesar, I'm on to Spain. Sounds like a pretty good deal, huh? Yikes. I have a feeling it's not going to end well. Around the year 60 to 61, they began the journey to Rome, which is by sea. And so, you know, he's setting out from Caesarea now. If we were to look at the maps, from Caesarea over to Rome, that's going to be a little journey. It's going to take him time to get there because the Acts of the Apostles is going to tell us about storms and a shipwreck and wintering in Malta, which doesn't sound like such a bad thing. But it's going to take him a while to get to Rome. Finally, when he's in Rome, he's under house arrest for 2 years. Okay, he's confined. Maybe it's during this time that he wrote to the Philippians or his letter to Philemon. He was under house arrest for 2 years, which simply means that he couldn't go out. But if you wanted to go see him, see him. Prisca and Aquila, we talked about them being with Paul in Ephesus and in Rome. So we can imagine how it was that they were there visiting him. After the summer of 64 CE or AD, we know that Paul died at some point. When he died, we don't know. We presume it was probably sometime between 64 and 67 AD. But neither the Acts of the Apostles nor Paul's letters speak of his death. And so we don't have any source that speaks of his death. The tradition that survives, that was passed on, was that he was killed by Nero in Rome, which makes sense insofar as Nero was persecuting the Christians. Under Nero's reign, Peter was killed in Rome, so it's possible that Peter was killed in Rome under that same persecution. It's possible that it was around 64. It's possible that it could have been later than that. We don't know how long it was. According to the tradition, Paul was buried there in what today is Rome, at a church which is now called St. Paul outside the walls. And so outside the walls of the city of Rome at that time, along this Via Ostiensis, was the place where Paul was buried according to tradition. And according to tradition, then, the church that sprang up there was on the place where he was buried.